Welcome to our 8th AIB webinar featuring the latest research from Journal of International Business Studies and Journal of International Business Policy. My name is Klaus Meyer. I'm a professor of international business at the AIB Business School, and I'll be your host. My co-host today is Minbaeva, who is a professor of strategic and global HRM at the Copenhagen Business School, where she's also a vice president for international affairs. Most importantly, in the current context, she's also the senior editor at GDMC with special responsibility for areas around human resource management and human capital. Before we start today's session, I'd like to dedicate the session to Ali Dastmalkian, who, of course, we know as a contributor to the International Human Resource Management Research Agenda, very much associated with the GLOBE project, which we all know a lot about and very impressed about the research they've done in that group. He also was the Dean of University of Victoria Business School and at the Business School of the Simon Fraser University. He sadly passed away last month, and he is the first author of one of the papers we're featuring today. So let me just say a few words about the general purpose of what we're doing. The idea is to create a forum for sharing research published in our two journals, utilizing the opportunities of new technology. I would like to thank the various people that have made this possible, including Alain Fabeke as the editor-in-chief of GDMC, Sariana Lundan from JIBP, and Jeremy Clegg and the entire board of the AIB. The most important people in practice are the technology people. That's Renfei Gao, who's in Manchester, and of course Tunga Kiak at the AIB office in Michigan State University. Just the general idea behind what we're doing is that we pick sets of papers that have recently been published in either of our journals and put them together to discuss one of the big questions in our field. So we have not just paper presentations, but talk about what are the broader implications of that. We try to bring experienced and younger scholars together, so we get a variety of views on the topic. You as audience can actively participate in the discussions. Please do so using the Q&A function. If you type in questions there, they will come to the attention of the moderator. Today that's Minbaeva. And Dana will select questions from that set and ask those questions to the panelists. You can also like questions there, which basically means you vote questions up the priority. And the higher on the priority list the questions are, the more likely Dana will see them and pay attention to them. Please use that opportunity to engage. And with that introduction, I will hand over to Minbaeva, who will talk a little bit about the theme today, which is how do MNEs manage their human capital globally. Anna.
Thank you very much, Klaus. Thank you for the introduction, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. How can MNEs best manage their human capital strategically? The question that we in the field of international human resource management have sought to answer for a while. If you think about it, ever since Rosenzweig and Nochria published their paper on HRM practices transfer at the beginning of 90s in GDMC, there have been a stream of research basically trying to understand what can we do, i.e. what kind of practices can we use to manage behavior of individuals individually and collectively, so that those individuals could influence performance of the subsidiary and the whole multinational enterprises, again, individually and collectively. However, recently the international HRM field has been heavily criticized for being theoretical, and some authors also pointed out that IHRM is not really involved into the fruitful interdisciplinary dialogue. And despite of being uniquely positioned to examine people-related challenges in global society, Some authors believe that international HRM scholars have failed to address so-called quote-unquote big questions. Further, the experience of the COVID-19 crisis also has showed that useful knowledge that international HRM field has created, which could have informed and supported management practices in this difficult time, actually remains quite dispersed and fragmented. So in practice, like its big sister strategic human resource management, the field of international HRM is quote unquote hitting the wall in terms of offering understanding how to handle new people-related challenges of the 21st century and deliver value to the organizations and global society. So where we are now and where we potentially can be if we manage to jump over that proverbial wall. Are there new theories, alternative conceptualization, different perspectives that we can actually adapt to stop hitting this wall and truly advance in our understanding of people-related challenges in multinational enterprises? So these are the questions that we would like to discuss with you today. And the first paper that we invited to kick off that discussion is a paper by Nick Bacon and entitled High Performance Work System and Organizational Performance Across Societal Cultures. The paper came out in JIPS this year. We've chosen this paper as a first paper to kick off this discussion simply because this paper summarizes very nicely everything we know about high performance work systems and performance in the context of international business. So Nick, the floor is yours.
Thanks ever so much, Dana, and to Klaus for inviting us to present the paper. It's particularly important to us that this session is in honour of our esteemed colleague, Ali Das-Malchan. The very fact that you see so many authors on this paper is testimony to Ali's intellectual leadership and his ability to build friendships across the world and to bring together groups of international scholars. So it's a great honour to us, and Ali will be a much missed friend for many of us in the community. So what we're doing in this paper, so I'm just trying to move on to the next screen. So it just seems to be a bit sticky.
Can click on this slide, maybe, no?
Okay, I shall try. There we go. Thank you, Dana. So a big theme, obviously, within international business is the question of convergence towards best practices in management on a global scale, and to what extent differences between nations should affect the management practices that are adopted. This is a particularly interesting area in the field of human resource management because we have contrasting evidence regarding the effectiveness of HR practices in different countries. And this contrasting evidence is summarized largely by two different perspectives. On the one hand, a universalistic perspective, and on the second hand, a contingency perspective. Now, the universalistic perspective has become very dominant within the field of strategic human resource management. For the last 25 years, the field has developed large-scale and convincing meta-analytical evidence showing that there is an association between high-performance work systems and organizational performance. High-performance work systems, of course, are a specific set of best practices associated with human resource management. Now, although this research initially started off in the United States, it's been reproduced in many different countries, showing that this relationship really does seem to hold up in different institutional and societal culture contexts. The implications of this perspective is that there should be some convergence economically over time as firms with high performance work systems outperform those that don't. And what should multinational companies and other firms do? Well, the suggestion here is adopt high performance work practices, high performance work systems, regardless of the institutional and societal context in which you're operating. But this is very contentious, particularly within the field of international business and international human resource management. Within this field, there's a strong theoretical tradition and emphasis on contingency, the suggestion that the effectiveness of individual HR practices will vary between countries in a manner consistent with theories such as Globe's culturally endorsed theory of leadership, which of course would suggest that leadership and management practices should vary to match societal culture in different nations. So this implies continued divergence or continued difference in HR practices between different countries. What should multinational companies and other companies do? Largely pay great attention to societal context and institutional context and ensure that their HR practices fit with societal culture. Now, we had a good international team and a good mixture of people on our research project. And I come from the HRM field, so very much I kind of buy into the universalistic perspective. But many of my colleagues are international and cross-cultural management experts, and they generally believed in the contingency perspective. So what we tried to do by combining our team was basically to test these two arguments. So what our paper does is we test whether in markedly different countries, is it the case that high performance work systems are associated with high performance, consistent with the universalistic perspective, or is this relationship moderated by societal culture, as the contingency perspective would suggest? So the background model, and I'll just kind of highlight a bit here about our thinking. First, on the left-hand side, we're not measuring the impact of individual HR practices. And we don't do this because the broader evidence in the field of HR suggests that individual practices will not be associated with organizational performance. So kind of the lesson then for IB scholars is if you're looking at HR, don't just concentrate on individual practices. You need to account for the HR system as a whole. So what we measure is the high performance work system. And within the high performance work system, we also want various theories about why these practices might actually be positive for organizational performance. And the predominant model currently within the field is called AMO, the Ability, Motivation, Opportunities model. And we look at groups of practices within high performance work systems that are ability and skill enhancing practices such as training and careful selection of human capital, motivation enhancing practices around pay, employment security, for example, and opportunity enhancing practices, sharing information freely with shop floor workers and team working, for example. Now, our assumption is that these practices will be associated as groups of practices, as well as the high performance work system, with organizational performance. Now, in contrast to some contingency work in international business, which has largely used a dependent variable, which is employee attitudes, we very much concentrate on organizational performance. And that's quite important. That might explain some of our results. We also measure societal culture, not using Globe scores, which have been collected some years ago now, but we actually measure societal culture within the workplaces that we're looking at and scale it up to society in which those organizations operate. So we're trying to combine both good practices for measuring high performance work systems and HR with good practices for measuring societal culture and trying to look at the most strategically important issue in international business, which is organizational performance. And ultimately, we're trying to see whether the societal culture measured across the top here moderates the relationship between high performance work systems and aspects of those and organizational performance here on the right hand side. So without further ado, what do we find? Well, we have some confidence in our findings because we use matched employer-employee data. We have a sample of 387 firms in 3 industries to try and control some of the variance in 14 quite radically different countries in terms of societal culture. And our findings very much support the universalistic perspective. We find that high performance work systems are positively associated with organizational performance in diverse countries, and societal culture does not moderate this relationship. Looking at the component aspects of high performance work systems, we find that skill enhancing practices and opportunity enhancing practices are both positively associated with organizational performance, and their impacts are not moderated by societal culture. We did find a little bit of support for the contingency theory where it came to high power distance societies and the effectiveness of opportunity enhancing practices. And this is often found in quite a bit of other research. The suggestion that if you try and share, for example, information with employees and you organize on the basis of teams, but you have high power distance in a society, then people, managers and employees feel uncomfortable with those responsibilities. However, once we take in high power distance countries opportunity enhancing practices, and we look at organizations that also adopt other aspects of high-performance work systems, skill-enhancing practices, and opportunity-enhancing practices, then we find the impact of power distance starts to disappear and ultimately disappears completely. So a little bit of support for continuous there, but very strong support overall for the universalistic perspective. Now, what's the theoretical takeaway here, and why is this important? How can we explain it? So our explanation is that we're quite prepared to accept that on the basis of evidence, societal culture does moderate the effectiveness of individual HR practices. Those individual HR practices are only one thing amongst many management messages that employees come across. And given uncertainty often within organisations, employees will then fall back on societal culture as a frame of reference to understand the effectiveness of these practices and how they should respond. However, once you combine HR practices together, what we think is happening here is that you get complementary messages about the types of skills that we expect employees to have, the types of motivation and contribution, the aims that they should have, the type of contribution at work and opportunities that they should make use of. And we think that sends a very strong cultural message within organizations. So the culture, the positive culture encouraged by high-performance work systems, sends a coherent message that we think overweighs the impact of societal culture on employees' attitudes. So hence employees, when they're thinking, how should I respond in this organization? Yes, societal culture will influence their view, but if high performance work systems send a really clear message, then that's a message that seems to cut through. Hence, we find that overall, high performance work systems are associated with organization performance and not moderated by societal culture. So in terms of future directions, what might we also want to know? Well, we concentrated on the relationship between HR practices and organizational performance. So we don't speak in our paper about the impact on employee attitudes, but of course we could measure these. I suspect that what might be happening, and this is a hypothesis that we will continue to explore, is that some aspects of high performance work systems might increase employee commitment and have positive impacts for them. Some of them might increase employee control of employee actions, and therefore this combination of commitment and control might make employees highly effective because they know what they to do and they're highly motivated to do those things. So we're interested really in kind of understanding the black box of employee attitudes a little bit more in this field. I think we place a big emphasis on the importance of building strong organizational climates and cultures that moderate and push to one side the impact of societal culture. So that raises the question as to exactly which HR practices play a key role in generating strong organizational cultures, and how indeed might multinational companies build and maintain these cultures across borders through effective high-performance work systems. Thirdly, societal culture is important, but it's not the only contingent factor in multinationals or organizations. And I think it's important to think about whether the organizational structure within multinationals might be conducive towards the effectiveness of high-performance work systems. An organizational structure itself in multinationals might moderate the impact between the relationship between high-performance work systems and organizational performance. And then finally from me here, the big question, of course, within the field of high-performance work systems is we have strong evidence that they work. Why don't all firms adopt them? So, of course, we need to get back to this question of the limited diffusion of high-performance work systems, both within economies overall and within multinationals to their subsidiaries. So those are some of the issues that I think we need to address. So Dana?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Nick. Indeed. And as I said at the very beginning, this paper is a perfect summary of where we are right now in international HRM. As you mentioned, firmly standing on ability, motivation, opportunity framework, hence skill enhancing, motivation enhancing, opportunity enhancing practices. We are also by now persuaded that we are talking about systems, not individual practices, because there is not a single company that does just one thing. And we're also persuaded that, HRM as a system actually much more interesting to consider what kind of, you could say, general signaling effect does it actually have on employees. We also by now persuaded, and your article is basically pointing out that firmly that yes, HRM does matter. Now the next question, it matters now what? You could say that high-performance work system approach was criticized for the assumption of the average individual. You could say that, you know, we are implementing this system of practices, and an individual will just react in a uniform way. And of course, they don't. And then within the strategic HR literature, there is actually also, you know, very strong focus on the whole micro foundations, the role of individual, perceived practices, and things like this. But there is also another aspect, and I'm going to use it here to move to the next presenter. Something happens when individuals get together, and that's actually what you're observing, Nick, as well, right? So you're saying that, hey, when they get together, it's some kind of a synergy effects, complementarity effects. Individuals start interact, and something is happening there. I would say that in order for us to understand what is happening there exactly, useful theoretical lens is offered by the literature of strategic human capital. Now, we've invited Shad here to present his paper. That actually is not 2020 published GIPS paper. It came out a little bit earlier. But there is a very interesting promise of looking at the typology of human capital in multinationals. Shad?
Thanks, Donna. First of all, let me just thank Nick. I really enjoyed reading that paper. And one of the things that I think is very powerful about that particular paper is that it's putting a stake in the ground from a multinational perspective to say, in general, we have many differences, but there are a lot of things that sort of bond us together, and that is the need for empowerment, the need for developing skills and becoming better at something, getting good at something, which is what a lot of the high performance work systems put in place, right? And so the fact that they were able to show that this universally applies across organization, across countries, and across cultures is a strong statement, and I think the first where we've been able to, as scholars in this area, been able to put a stake in the ground and say, no, this matters regardless of the culture you live in. And of course, how there are nuances in how that's implemented, of course, as they found. But I just wanted to really briefly touch on that because I think that's a very important paper. And if you haven't read it, please do read that. Getting to the paper we're working on, this is a bit of a shift where we're not looking at HR practices per se, but we're looking at the human capital, your human capital portfolio, your talent within your organization. And taking this sort of portfolio investment approach, how do you invest in your employees? How do you invest in the right mix of human capital for your organization? And what should that right mix be based on your strategic imperatives and what you're trying to accomplish within your organization? So the paper I'd like to present, that this is a paper with Scott Snell and Ingmar Bjorkman that we had been working on for quite some time. This is a theory paper, a completely theoretical paper, where we presented a framework. This framework comes from a lot of prior empirical work examining how organizations manage their people across multinational enterprises. In particular, Scott Snell and I have been involved in a very large multi-stage research project with the World Bank over the last 15 years, where we have tried to examine how human and social capital are utilized by globally dispersed projects to achieve optimal development impact, as well as the development of organizational capabilities. Many of the insights for this paper have come from this setting. So this is very much a phenomena-driven theory, which of course jives with the IB literature and IB scholars as well. Many of the settings for this paper also come from work that I've done with Ingmar, where we have been working and have worked on a book on the global challenge and international human resource management. And that's a book with Vlado Pucic and Paul Evans as well. The framework we propose in this paper examines how location-specific human capital is transformed into an MNE specific asset, and how that asset can be utilized to create value for MNEs. Now, let me just go to the to set you up why we're interested in this strategic aspect of human capital. I'm of the belief that all good theory starts with a real world problem. The more I speak with managers and work with companies, the more I'm convinced that the thing global organizations struggle with the most is developing and managing their human capital or talent portfolio. For example, how do we expand from one country to the next? How do we manage this cross-cultural border venture? How do we avoid core rigidities and learning myopias? All of these factors are successfully or unsuccessfully accomplished through a geographically dispersed set of employees. Moreover, many countries and companies struggle to find, utilize, and train people with the relevant skills for an increasingly uncertain future work environment. And so if you look here on this list of quotes, these are from multilateral agencies and different organizations that have shown and have argued, and these are all recent statements saying in today's increasingly complex COVID pandemic environment, uncertainty prevails, and one of the best tools we have is to understand how we can measure and understand and use human capital to drive economic growth. So this is the sort of, to motivate this paper and to motivate this theory, this I believe is where we need to be going as scholars, not just as HR, international HR scholars, but as IB scholars. And I think we have a lot to say. I think we have the most to say in this area. And so if let me talk about the research question based off of this then. The purpose of this paper is to more systematically explain how local knowledge from geographically dispersed employees can be transformed into a valuable corporate asset. We developed this framework that depicts the HR architecture of an MNE's global human capital portfolio. And again, this gets at how does an organization manage its portfolio of human capital? And so we've taken this portfolio investment approach to do this. The question we ask to answer this, to get at this, is which types of human capital matter most in a globally complex and changing environment? To answer this question, we examined the types of human capital likely to create value for the MNE. We examined two dimensions of human capital in terms of how specific the human capital is to the firm itself and how specific the human capital is to the locations in which the MNE units are operating. And this was a sort of a unique perspective. Geographic economists have been talking about location specificity for a while, obviously. So this has been very prevalent in the IB literature, but from a human capital perspective, from an HR perspective, this has not been done. And so we wanted to bring in this literature, this IB literature, to help understand this context. What this does is this gives us 4 types of human capital that can create value for the MNE. MNEs need all 4 types of human capital to create value. So we're not arguing that different organizations will use just one or the other, but the mix, that portfolio mix of where we invest and what the right amount is will depend upon our strategy, depend upon the external environment in which we're operating. So the appropriate mix will depend on that. Now, if you look, I'm going to go real quickly through each of these types of human capital to give you sort of a better understanding of what they mean and what they can do for organizations. The first type of human capital is local human capital. Local human capital consists of the knowledge, skills, and abilities and other attributes that make up the location-specific experience of employees in a particular country or market. These skills include understanding customer needs, cultural traditions, institutional barriers, and political processes which may differ across countries. Individuals develop local human capital as they spend time working with local customers, learning about the customer's lifestyles and expectations. Companies can either hire people who already have these necessary skills. So if you look at an investment perspective, it's do we hire, do we make, or do we buy this product? Do we make this human capital, or do we buy it? Or they can provide training to develop this. For example, let me talk a little bit about Haier, the Chinese kitchen appliance maker. Started up a research and development center in the United States a few years back. It set up new operations in a city known as Evansville, Indiana. Evansville was the former home of Whirlpool's Refrigerator Design Center, and Haier knew it could hire smart designers who already knew the local tastes of US customers when they entered the US market. Now, not surprisingly, local human capital can transfer to competitors. And so if you look here, you see location specificity is low in terms of location specificity. Or local human capital is low in terms of location specificity. It's also low in terms of firm specificity. And so as a result, Hire was able to go into this area and hire employees either away from the current competitors, or in this case, what had happened was Whirlpool had left Indiana and moved to Michigan. And so there were a lot of unemployed designing R&D workers in this space who Hire was able to pick up quite easily. Next, if you move up to the right, the top right quadrant, you see subsidiary human capital. When you combine, and this is sort of this quintessential piece and component for creating competitive advantage for MNEs. When you combine location-specific knowledge with company-specific knowledge, you get employees with subsidiary human capital. Subsidiary human capital is company knowledge within a firm-specific location. For example, if we go back to the Hire situation, Hire employees in Indiana learned about the way things are done in the company and how to navigate the Chinese style of efficiency. They were able to combine at least this Chinese style of efficiency with Hire. They were able to combine that knowledge with their knowledge of local taste to effectively design innovative products for the US market, but at a much lower price point. And so they're combining this knowledge of how Hire does things, the Hire way of working, with the knowledge of the local environment, creating what we call subsidiary human capital. The next component is, if you go over to the top left quadrant, you see corporate human capital. This includes company-specific knowledge, skills, and abilities that transcend any particular location within the entire global company, and not just simply the collective knowledge of staff at headquarters. Corporate human capital is knowledge about the policies and procedures and goals that are constant across a company's global operations. As individual employees communicate across borders with managers from corporate headquarters and other subsidiary and main offices, they often develop corporate human capital. Leadership development programs within multinationals are often explicitly designed to achieve this kind of corporate human capital. For example, if we go back to the Hire case, one of the ways they invested in developing corporate human capital of getting their local employees within the subsidiary in Indiana to understand the corporate vision was to do rotation programs. So these R&D workers, they sent them out on rotation programs. They sent them to China. They sent them to other R&D centers around the globe. And through this experience, they developed this knowledge specific to the company that helps them internalize and deliver on the mission and vision of the company. So rather than dictating protocols through a top-down approach, in this particular case, they use this rotational leadership program as a bottom-up approach to develop an employee's corporate human capital. Of course, there are many ways that a company can invest in this type of human capital, but this is one specific example of how an organization might invest in this type of human capital, depending upon their needs, of course. The last category, of course, is international human capital. It's often overlooked because of how low it's low in company specificity. It's also low in location specificity. This characteristic makes a person's international human capital highly portable between organizations and the key to keeping ahead in global industries. International human capital includes knowledge of global best practices, global industry standards, international trade laws, modular systems and processes, cross-border industry networks, and other experiences, for example. If we go back again to the Hire case, when Hire entered the US market, it hired a US refrigerator salesperson to manage the new subsidiary. The manager not only possessed strong knowledge of the local context, which was they possessed local human capital, but this manager, he also had extensive experience working abroad with companies worldwide. He had a strong sense of industry best practices and had developed a significant network of contacts around the globe. This international human capital enabled the new country manager to help Hire become a global industry player, and not just another Chinese company selling low-cost products in the United States. So it was able to transform Hire by taking this portfolio approach to developing the right mix of human capital for strategic purposes. Hire was able to be successful in its new market. Now, this all gets us to the last slide. Sorry about that, I messed up here. Let me get us to the last slide. Future directions. Let me reshare my screen here. Okay. So if I have 3 areas that I think are vitally important for future research in international HR. A lot of our current research around international HR, along with, it actually follows along with a lot of our international strategy and IB literature in general, tends to follow this value capture logic. In essence, most scholarship adopts a shareholder supremacy assumption that we adopted from finance, to be quite honest. This argument, this logic argues that shareholders are a firm's only residual claimants. In other words, that shareholders, that everyone else is a fixed cost to the organization, everything else is a fixed cost to the organization, and the profitability mostly goes to the shareholders. Adopting this logic from strategy has been probably, I believe, a downfall of the international HR area. So international HR scholars tend to see employees as fixed costs as a result. And in this sense, we say, if managed well through whatever systems we have, whatever management practices we have, will help the firm to generate greater profits. Now, this, of course, is true, and this is valuable. It helps organizations increase profitability, but it does not examine how some types of human capital might be better positioned to create value for the firm and the employee, depending upon a continuous perspective. So in general, what this does is this tells us that, hey, human capital doesn't really matter that much. It's really the overall mix for creating profitability for shareholders. So what we tried to do in our theoretical paper was to point out that employees increasingly represent variable costs, and that some types of human capital are strategically more valuable than other types. This logic brings on more of a stakeholder approach. This allows employees to become residual claimants rather than fixed claimants of firm profits. When an employee becomes a residual claimant, the employee becomes part of the strategic decision-making mechanism and can begin to appropriate some of the rents he or she generates. Hence, some employees may share in firm profits, etc. Now, we see this. We're seeing this in the real world. We see this in a lot of the professional service firms as employees become, as we get more into a knowledge-based economy, more of the decisions are made by the employees in organizations. And more of those employees are appropriating a lot of the rents they're generating. And those rents will vary. They'll take on ownership, they'll take on the strategic decision-making within the organization. So this perspective helps theory, I believe, more closely match today's realities, where workers represent a dynamic portfolio of assets that can be combined in different and multiple ways to create value for themselves and their MNEs. If employees and managers provide access to human capital resources that are vital to a firm's generating profits, then these human capital providers become vital sources of variable rents. This means that the future international HRM research, I believe, should adopt a stakeholder approach to examining the human capital found within the MNE. So that's my first sort of, I think this is where we go in the future, a stakeholder approach. The second, if we do that, that means we need to bring in some other theories to account for the variability, for the dynamics that go on within an organization. As a person enters an organization, they come with an incomplete contract. And within that incomplete contract, over time, as they start creating more and more value, if I create more value for my neighbor, then my contract is going to change from my neighbor's contract, which we may have the same job description, right? And so it's important that we have a theory to help understand that. And one of the theories I believe that can help us do that is the incomplete contract theory, which of course is a finance theory. So going back to finance again, even though they created the problem for us in the first place. So this incomplete contract theory can provide a solution to existing strategy theories by allowing employees over time to gain residual rights of control on how decisions are made about resource allocation and profit appropriation. Jay Barney, Sharon Alvarez, and I have a paper in Academy Management Perspectives this year that actually draws in this incomplete contract theory to understand this dynamic process of resource allocation and rent value creation and value appropriation. Now, the final one, and I believe I am running out of time. So the final one is related to an ecosystem perspective. And this is related to a stakeholder perspective, but we're seeing a growing emphasis in the strategic management literature on the importance of ecosystems. Oxley, Silverman, Adner, others have been talking about this more than any other type of organization. I believe MNEs, if there is any organization out there, MNEs represent this quintessential organizational ecosystem. Changing conditions invite local variation, coupled with the need for global integration. This variety stimulates renewal, as some elements exhibit better fit and thrive, while others recede or are eliminated. While these different elements compete at times, they also contribute to and depend upon others for survival. As such, this ecosystem perspective acts as a dynamic community evolving over time to create a more robust environment. For example, let me give you an example. I was reading about this not too long ago during the COVID pandemic. We've seen many political leaders closing doors and closing borders. At the same time, we're seeing scientists across myriad research labs, across multiple organizations, across multiple countries, opening their doors. These R&D groups from different countries, companies, and cogitations are working to bring diverse ideas to the table to help solve a common problem, a coronavirus vaccine. The ability of these diverse teams to come together comes in a common core principle around solving a broad problem that affected the entire world, not one particular firm. And so as we see more and more employees, as a result, this ecosystem offers a framework to manage employees that aren't necessarily within the traditional borders of an organization or of a country. And so as a result, it gets at what the company does well in being able to deliver its products or services to customers. Seen this way, the role of international HRM, I believe, is not just useful for implementing strategy. The role of international HRM going forward is essential for catalyzing capabilities and creating value in the world we live in.
Yes, thank you so much, Shad. I do apologize for noise creation, because that's usually what happens when you're sitting in super important live recording video. Your kid is calling right in the middle of everything, right? Apologies for that. So just to zoom in on important shifts that we've just had with this paper for attendees, we no longer talk about practices per se, but we are talking about what these practices create. Right, so the shift, as you can see, the shift that we're inviting international HRM scholars to do is not only study practices, but what does it actually create? And in this particular case, Shad pointed out that the creation, ultimately, MNE human capital, is actually super interesting and not monotonic. It's extremely beneficial to look at it as a dynamic portfolio of strategic human capital resources. And because of the various interactions, we actually can, of course, go with the value appropriation. It's not only finance, but it's also labor economists to blame in here. But at the same time, we actually could shift our attention on an increase of human capital rent by increasing value appropriation. And in a sense, you could say that because multinational enterprises could dynamically combine and recombine different types of human capital and deploy the combination strategically, as you pointed out through your case study, maybe become a source of competitive advantage for multinationals. And that's probably why they outperform domestic firms, because there the dynamic recombination does not really exist. Our next paper actually looks specifically in a particular type of human capital that is international human capital. And Sabina, who is joining us in the middle of the night from Australia, thank you so much for being with us, is going to talk about the role of global dynamic managerial capability in the pursuit of international strategy and superior performance. So Sabina, the floor is yours.
Hi, everybody, and welcome. From Sydney, Australia. I'm Professor of International Business here at the University of Sydney. I also hold Professorship of Strategic Leadership and Diversity at Copenhagen Business School. But I'm currently based in Australia without the opportunity to travel. So I'm really delighted to be able to share my work with you tonight. And it's a paper which is co-authored with Bo Nielsen, also from Copenhagen Business School and University of Sydney, and was published in the JIP special issue on dynamic capabilities in international business. So we have yet another shift in the focus, and this time we're talking about managerial level capital or human capital. When Dana and I had brief conversation about this last week, I really like the question that she asked: how can MNEs best manage their strategic human capital? And particularly the question how people individually or collectively influence firm performance is something that has been debated across various disciplines for a long time. As somebody who has worked at the intersection of strategy and international business for quite some time now, it becomes very clear that people make strategic decisions that influence organizational level outcomes, such as strategy and performance. And it's interesting because if you listen to the IB conversations, very often we talk about firm level decisions and firm level experience, but in reality, there's no such thing as firm level experience. It usually is a human experience that influences decisions. So, and very often those are the top decision makers at the organizations. Those will be the top managers that make the strategic decisions that influence the strategy of the firm, and ultimately, not only employees, but also customers in multiple countries and multiple locations and so on. So it's really important, I believe, to start detaching from that notion of organizational level experience and organizational level decisions, and really acknowledge that those decisions, even at the top levels of organizations, are made by humans. And as humans, we have natural human limitations, right? Our decisions are not always rational as we want them to be. And the backgrounds of individuals in particular have a huge influence on the type of decisions they make. So what theories can help us? What theories are out there that help us advance our understanding of individual and team decision-making in international business? One of the most often referred to theories is upper echelons theory, which suggests that it's actually not an individual, but a team of individuals that collectively or jointly make decisions. So as Dana mentioned before, right? Individual comes together and magically something happens, right? Magically, collectively, we employ our individual experiences, our various perspectives that we have into decision-making. And that also means that who sits on the top management team really determines the type of decisions that corporations make and their consequences, not only in terms of performance, but various other consequences that I'm sure we'll return to in the discussion section. So another really useful theoretical perspective is dynamic capabilities. And particularly when we talk about dynamic managerial capabilities, which are the capabilities with which managers build, integrate, and reconfigure organizational resources and competencies in complex and highly uncertain changing environments. Sounds very familiar these days, right? We definitely, organizations operate in highly complex and uncertain environments. But what is really more important is that this is something that MNEs have worked with or have dealt with, facing the challenges of multiple institutional environments, complex, changing at different times, different directions, and so on, for a long time. Yet dynamic capabilities is something that we have largely ignored in IB until recently. So what are dynamic managerial capabilities? They're a key mechanism to align firms' competencies with changes in the external environment, and they reflect three underlying factors. That will be managerial human capital, managerial social capital, and managerial cognitions, which are the beliefs and mental models that serve as basis for decision-making. So these three sources of dynamic managerial capabilities actually help explain differences in managerial decisions, which ultimately influence firm performance. In this particular paper, we propose a new construct, a novel construct. We extend the construct of dynamic managerial capabilities to IB, and we argue that global dynamic managerial capabilities is a useful concept to understand decision-making in an international environment. So we define the three sources of global dynamic managerial capabilities as international human capital, which will be international education or work experience, which will bring knowledge and skills relevant to firms operating in international environment. And that naturally refers to what Shad was talking about earlier when we talk about international human capital. The second important component of global dynamic managerial capabilities is international social capital. And particularly when it comes to top management teams or to top managers, foreign board memberships are really important because they give them access to other MNCs, other organizations, to their best practices, their decision-making. So they really provide top managers with access to external resources and information that they can utilize in the decision-making of their focal company. And the third and last component is international cognitions, which refers to the national cultural diversity of the top management teams. And we all know that cultural backgrounds is associated with diversity in values, beliefs, and mental models, which inform the decision-making. So what we propose is that global dynamic managerial capabilities is a multidimensional construct in which all these three aspects are interrelated. Naturally, human and social capital are related, right? I mean, the more international educational experience you have, the more international contacts you have, and vice versa. But what is really important is to consider all three together as a source of global dynamic managerial capabilities. Some of those have been studied in isolation in previous research, in previous IB research, but no prior research has considered them together as a one important construct that influences managerial decision-making. So we defined three hypotheses. Our first hypothesis is actually about the growth in global dynamic managerial capabilities. We argued that in the ever-changing environments that MNEs are facing, they consciously increase their global dynamic managerial capability over time. And in this particular paper, I won't go in much detail into the methodology, but we utilize latent growth modeling methodology, where we find a significant linear growth, a significant increase in global dynamic managerial capabilities of the firms in our sample. And we have the publicly listed or publicly listed Swiss companies over a period of 8 years prior to the global financial crisis. The second hypothesis suggests that global dynamic managerial capabilities will be positively related to the reconfiguration of firm assets and resources across different geographic regions and different foreign entry modes. The underlying reason behind, the underlying logic behind this hypothesis is that managers or managerial teams with global dynamic managerial capabilities are more likely to assess the costs and benefits of working in various environments, and they're also more likely to actually reconfigure organizational resources across different national borders and also across different entry modes. So in many ways, that refers to being better able to oversee the portfolio of international operation and utilize all three sources of global dynamic managerial capabilities to make better decisions. And this is basically what our third hypothesis suggests, is that such reconfigurations will result in positive financial performance, or that the reconfiguration of firm assets and resources is acting as a mediator between global dynamic managerial capabilities and subsequent firm performance. So we find support for all three hypotheses. And if I move forward to the future research direction, let me first quickly say what are our contributions to IB theory. We believe our first contribution is that we bring the attention back to the individuals and teams and how they influence international decision-making in MNEs. We also develop a novel multidimensional construct where we identify the three main sources, but also discuss the interrelations among those three sources, how they relate to each other and how they influence decision-making. And furthermore, we explore the consequences of global dynamic managerial capabilities for firm strategy and performance in a two-stage process by utilizing a novel methodology, which is rarely used in strategic management or management in general. It actually originates from psychology and so far probably not used in IB. And it really allows us to study the dynamic aspect of managerial capabilities over time, something that we need to do more and more in international business and strategy in general. So what are the questions for future research? I think one of the most important questions is we need to understand how human and social capital are interrelated, and particularly how jointly they influence MNEs outcomes. We often study only human capital or only social capital, but individuals often have both. And we need to study jointly the human and social capital of individuals or teams, organizational units, in order to be able to understand the impact on organizational level outcomes. The second important question is, as I said, we found a linear growth in the global dynamic managerial capabilities since the start of the century. So that was interesting, but the question is, are we going to face an end to this trend? Right? Is there a certain point from which, having more international human capital, social capital, and international managerial cognition is going to be detrimental to firm performance? Can too much human capital be hurt decision-making performance? Is something that we need to consider. And of course, what happens in the post-COVID times, right? What is going this trend to result in? And what is more important is, we decrease global mobility at the moment, right? Would that increase the value of international human capital? Or would it decrease it? If we have less mobility, if we have less expats, would international human capital be actually more valuable? Is question I would like to ask. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm really, really looking forward to the discussion.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sabina. And here again, if we go with our kind of overall narrative of that webinar, we moved from practices to what they create, human capital. And here, in addition to that, with Sabina's paper, we also brought in the relations, for instance, as you pointed out, social capital. So we're moving focus from individuals to their interactions. And I hope that's where international HR could eventually go. The dynamic managerial capabilities, it's a quite interesting concept. And actually, if you think about it, it does not necessarily only apply to top management teams, because we can also look at it at other levels, although the link with the performance will then have to be established through multi-level theorizing. So I very much thank the presenters for their inputs, and now turn to the questions. And again, you can put your question in Q&A part. And we have a question here from Francis Kumara that I think I'd like you, Nick, to take up first, and then we will pass it around to other panelists. Francis is asking, given that many MNEs are involved in international strategic alliances, what strategies do MNEs use to effectively manage culturally diverse workforce, right? So that's creation through the strategic alliances, so that aspect perhaps. So Nick, can you give it a first try?
Yeah, thank you, Francis, for a really interesting question. What do we know? So we know that when multinational enterprises operate overseas, that they bear the imprint of some of the HR practices from their domestic context. So when for example, when Japanese firms go overseas, they tend to want to introduce some aspects of Japanese management. So I guess the challenge when firms are involved in international strategic alliances is whether one of the partners is particularly dominant, in which case we might expect to see the transfer of practices, particularly from that dominant firm into the strategic alliance. I guess another issue in my mind is whether it's a learning opportunity. So given that the evidence I'm showing is that high performance work systems are effective in all contexts, that would suggest that rather than worrying about cultural differences where the strategic alliance may operate, it's a great opportunity to learn the best of the high performance work system from both partners and bring it together to develop a really impressive high performance work system going together. So if the opportunity is often to learn from each other and to build a bigger and better company in a particular sector, then there's opportunities to develop those high performance work systems in a more effective way by learning from each other and how each other do it effectively.
Thank you, Nick. So absolutely. So it is where they're coming from, where they're going, and with what purpose, right? And you are completely right at pointing out that another stream of literature in international HR on the dominance effect. And until recently, it was very much US-based multinationals that had that dominance effect. And then again, in this changing world, that would be interesting to reapproach that. Sabina, I know you worked on the strategic alliances in a while previously. So what's your take on this question?
Well, in international strategic alliances, what we often experience is fault lines or demographic fault lines based both on culture and functional background, because often companies form an alliance because they have complementary resources. We often find that, let's say, a technology firm might form an alliance with another firm, and then culture. So very often there is a very strong division based not only on national culture, but other aspects as well. And what we find in terms of the best practices for managing cultural diverse forces is really try to look beyond those differences, beyond the stereotyping and unconscious bias in classifying people as different others, and try to find more similarities between people based on different other characteristics, whether that could be age, it could be gender, or anything else. So very often when we have factional divides and subgroups in alliances, what helps is find bridges between those groups based on different types of characteristics.
Interesting. Shad, what's your take on this issue? Because I also know that you had some research going on strategic alliances before.
Yeah, it's interesting. If we take our research seriously, and if we take what Nick has found in their paper seriously, to me, what I would think needs to be done in these kinds of settings is bringing in more high performance work systems, but doing so in a way that is culturally sensitive or consistent with the local culture. In other words, Nick mentioned that a lot of why don't we have more high performance work systems implemented in organizations around the world? And I think a lot of it is, in the past, when HR scholars have talked about high performance work systems, they've seen this as it's a complex system, right? It's difficult to implement, and it was seen in many regards as a source of competitive advantage. Less and less we're seeing that necessarily as being the source of competitive advantage, because if everyone's doing it, it's not necessarily differentiating. But if it's important to do that, then I think you need to ask, what are the cultural barriers in being able to implement these kinds of high performance work systems in an alliance? Say we adopt it, we ally, and I don't think it differs much. We acquire a new company in a different country. Part of that process is, how do we implement if we're using high performance work systems, how do we implement those practices in that foreign culture? And I think we take a lot of lessons in how we manage cross-culturally, right? We use the culture, our cultural understanding, to effectively interact and know how we can communicate effectively what's important, but finding, as Sabina mentioned, those commonalities, those similarities, where that I think people want to be empowered, people want to develop skills, they want to get better at something, they want to have the opportunities so the AMO model, they want these things in general. The question is, how do we do so in a culturally applicable way?
Interesting. Thank you so much. I'd like to bring in a question that was Han Nguyen asked, and it actually addressed to you, Sabina, but I think we could build on Nick and Shad. So first of all, thanks for the interesting presentation. But the question is, what are the main differences between dynamic managerial capabilities and global dynamic managerial capabilities? So that, what's the boundary in these two concepts? I presume they are qualitatively different, you would argue.
Well, naturally, what's the difference between the dynamic
and global dynamic
managerial capabilities? So naturally, the difference is that the global dynamic managerial capabilities apply to the international human capital, international social capital, and foreign nationalities. So we don't measure, or we don't consider the human capital or investment or education work experience in the home country. We consider only the international education, international work experience. Same with social capital, right? We measure and we consider the advantages and benefits that are brought forward from international networks. And in international managerial recognition, we actually look at the cultural diversity of the top management team, which is very different, brings very different competitive advantage from a very homogeneous, like nationally homogeneous top management teams. In fact, we have a separate paper with both, where we find that cultural diversity top management teams lead to superior performance as well, right? So this is the main difference. So we really focus on these aspects of managerial dynamic capabilities that are relevant to international decision making.
Interesting. So, and I guess, Shad, if I take your typology for a spin in here, I would say that the word global comes in when you start playing with interactions between international human capital and corporate human capital. That's only true global dimension in there. While, for example, you know, interactions or local human capital or its interaction with subsidiary human capital, that's truly a local, you know, local dimension. Is that too much speculation, or do you see any point in going there?
No, I think as we move these models forward, right, it's a lot of it is as we, you know, looking at these global dynamic capabilities, what is global managerial dynamic capabilities? Am I getting that right, Sabina?
Yeah.
It's looking at the nuances behind them as well, right? So one of the things that Sabina mentioned for future research, it's this interaction between social and human capital. I think it's also the interaction between different types of human capital as well, right? It's the subsidiary or corporate and international. And what does that mean? And I think at this point, you have a broader perspective when you say international human capital, but we could probably break that down, and they could probably break that down maybe even with their data as it exists now, to sort of say, are there aspects of this international human capital that might represent more of a corporate human capital, or more of a just understanding the industry in general? What are things that are specific to the MNE versus not specific?
Right. So firm specific and general human capital that comes in there. And to the international HRM colleagues, I would say we in international HR are extremely knowledgeable about corporate human capital and subsidiary human capital. We've also been working a little bit with other two dimensions, but I think these interactions, that's what hopefully will bring our research agenda forward. Now, Shad, now I have your attention here. Marco de Sister is asking a question. Towards the end of your presentation, you mentioned that human capital should not considered as a fixed cost. In this case, do you think all of the 4 quadrants, i.e. all 4 types of human capital, should be more flexible and dynamic, or there is certain things that should be kept under the fixed cost approach?
So that's a great question. And really, to be honest, I would say all 4 quadrants should be seen as either a variable or a fixed cost. And so in other words, if one of the things we focus on in that theoretical paper is we focus on talent, and we define talent as individuals or skill sets that are specifically rare and valuable to the company, right? So these are strategically valuable skill sets. And in that regard, those are the types of human capital that you would see as being dynamic, flexible, potentially those that can create residual value that they can then appropriate some of that value for themselves. Whereas a lot of times there are skill sets that are somewhat valuable, that are necessary, sufficient for our operations as an organization. Those we could see as fixed costs. In other words, I come in, I pick up my paycheck, I do my job, and I walk out. That's a fixed cost. Or so all 4 of those quadrants could be fixed or variant. Okay.
Mm-hmm. And actually, just to follow up on that, before I go to Nick, I have a next question to you. Michelle Hermans had a very interesting observation, also that has question marks, but I think it's more idea that in fact, you know, the high performance work systems producing different types of social capital, you know, may have different degree, may require different degree of adaptation. It's really nice thought, Michelle. So it's really uniting the first 2 papers together. But Nick, I have a question for you from Jenny Benoit, who's basically asking, like everyone is going like, wow, no cultural difference really. And the follow-up question, did you slice your data in terms of emerging and developed countries? Either are there any differences emerging and developed countries, Nick?
No, I mean we generally found a universalistic perspective in that in developing countries we still find similarly a positive relationship between high performance work systems and organizational performance. We also tried to slice our data between the multinational enterprise workplaces we had and domestic workplaces. And again, we found no difference. both in multinational subsidiaries and in domestic workplaces. Again, we find this positive relationship between high-performance work systems and organizational performance.
When high-performance work systems are considered as a systems, but not as individual practices, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I would, on my own research, I would say that individual practices actually vary a lot between, or the most sensitive to the context. But hey, there's not a single company that just does one thing. There was also a question around the SME, small and medium enterprises contribution. It's a question by Oliver Tuin-Avonka. And I think that's a very fair question, because I think in international HRM, we're really not good enough at looking at, how we manage people within small and medium enterprises. So the question is that the most advanced and emerging economies have a high percentage of SMEs contributing to their GDP. How well is HRM looking into the issues of human and social capital to making these businesses more successful in the venture? And I kind of already preempted it, saying that we are not that good at looking at it, like we are way too obsessed with multinational corporations. But I'm grateful to Oliver to bring this human capital and social capital dimension. Anyone would like, Shad or Sabina, would you like to talk about this interaction between human capital and social capital, which is actually most visible in small and medium enterprises?
Nick, I thought you were raising, are you raising your hand?
I was raising it really to kind of answer the question on SMEs, really, which is just to briefly forefront the answer by explaining what we know about HRM in SMEs. Now, we've got studies from different countries looking at the relationship between HR practices and performance in SMEs. And I think the findings, again, are fairly similar. What it tends to show is that high-performance work systems also benefit small and medium-sized firms as they do large firms. But the benefit is slightly skewed. So what it seems to do is it makes small firms more productive, but not necessarily more profitable. So I think small firms are going through this process of building capabilities, investing in HR practices which don't yet have economies of scale to pay back. Hence, it's driving forward labour productivity, but the profits only come when that firm gets larger and larger. So you're putting in place the practices that you need and the skills that you need for long-term success. For those firms that are going to remain small, then you can increase your productivity by adopting high-performance work systems, but you're not necessarily going to see a profitable payback, because you're finding out about those schemes, implementing them, developing them are just more costly to you without economies of scale. And there's evidence kind of from different countries tending to show a similar kind of thing on SMEs.
Ah, interesting. So, hey, and one could also even complicate it further, saying, are we talking about performance parity in here or a sustained competitive advantage, taking to the next step? Anyway, Shad or Sabina, anything on this particular focusing on the interaction between human capital, social capital?
Well, I mean, the interaction between the two is really important, because if you are lacking certain aspects of human capital, if you are lacking certain knowledge or skills, through your social capital, you can actually access resources, right? So it's a different way of thinking about it. We always tend to think in terms of human capital as an investment, right? We invest in employees' education, we invest in their international human capital through international assignments and so on, so they gain knowledge from international environments. But actually, through developing networks and contacts, you can get access to resources rather than doing the investment in human capital. So that's, I think, one really important aspect of the interaction between the two.
And I would just kind of reiterate and combine what Nick and Sabina are both saying, which is, as you're a smaller organization, as you start out as a startup, moving into an SME, and as you grow, early on, what's more important are those networks, that human capital, those experiences you have. Those become most important. And so as a result, from an HR perspective, I think we're missing the boat a lot in not studying entrepreneurship, in not studying SMEs from a human capital, social capital perspective. And I think that there's a lot that we can do to contribute to that that space. So I think that that's a great question, whoever asked that question.
Indeed. I have a bunch of more or less clarifying questions, and there is one question from Yuran Lee, who basically says that I was wondering if there is a good, promising research opportunities of recombining, strategic human capital with the theme of expatriation. And if I may, absolutely, this is as with expatriation and the global transfer, that's the way to acquire both corporate human capital as well as international human capital. I think it was a part of your operationalization, Sabina. Is it correct?
Well, it's international experience, so it doesn't necessarily need to be expatriates. Could be, that somebody got employed, because in the top management teams, you don't need to be transferred from your company to another company. It could be that you are hired by a foreign company, but it can be part of our construct as well, right? So international experience, international human capital can be acquired both inside the company you're working for, or it could be also acquired in other companies as well.
You're muted, Donna.
Oh, Shad, that's also your argument on international and corporate human capital, right? That these two are acquired through different managerial practices.
Yeah, and in fact, I was just looking at that question, Yuran. I think that is one of the key areas for future research. I think looking at this from different contexts, so contextualizing this human capital and social capital in these different contexts, specifically around expats. How was this done? What does this look like? How does this evolve over time? To me, that's a very interesting research project, and that's ripe to be published in JIBS.
That's right. That's a good statement. Absolutely. So, Nick, clarifying question from Clint Chadwick. What's the level of analysis of HR practices, in the sense that is it really HR policies or it's HR practices that you've been measuring? I mean, we of course would say to Clint that he should go and read the paper, but hey, now give it the opportunity.
It's a good question. Hi, Clint. Thanks. So we standardized on workplace. And we standardized on workplace because we know that HR practices can vary between workplaces, even of the same firm. So we wanted to get the measurement as precise and as accurate as we could. So we measured HR practices at the workplace. We also measured specifically HR practices applied to the largest occupational group, because of course in some large workplaces you may get different HR practices applied to different groups. We then cross-referenced the managerial report of HR practices with the employees' report of HR practices to make sure there was sufficient relationship there. And we found that largely, even though some studies suggest quite a big difference there, we found that we could actually rely quite heavily on the managerial responses. So I think you're quite right. Unit of analysis is really important. But we actually found kind of the opposite to what you were suggesting, which is that the more localized those practices are measured, the closer to the workplace, then the more context might matter. Well, we measured them as close to the workplace as we could for a particular occupational group, and again we find context didn't matter. We also, of course, assessed for other things like we control for business strategy and other matters that we could control for. And again, the findings did seem to hold up.
So here we go, Clint. You gotta go and read that paper. Final question, Sabina, for you from Paul Goodham. He's basically saying that traditionally many top management teams in multinational enterprises have a home country bias. So is that changing dramatically? Management teams, they comprise from different nationalities, so to say. What's happening in there? Is that a dynamism in itself?
Yeah, well, for sure, we're in the 21st century. So if you look past, last century, most top management teams and boards were traditionally very homogeneous in terms of nationality. But with the mobility of labor markets, especially executive labor markets, every company tries to find the best executive, particularly when you look inside Europe. And we observe a large number of corporations, multinational corporations, have high percentage of foreign nationals, very often beyond 50%. And at the frontier of this will be UK companies, Swiss companies, the Netherlands, and this is increasing around the globe as well. So, and that's why I said, if you look at the beginning of the century from, the 2000 upwards, it's an upward trend. The question is how long it will continue to rise. But also, I want to link that to something I wanted to mention in my presentation. I forgot. Is also, it's time for us to start using theories from this century as well. Like, for instance, dynamic managerial capabilities is a theory from the 21st century. When we address modern questions and modern phenomena, we need to develop new theories. We need to, build on what we know, but really expand our understanding, because the world is changing. You cannot keep explaining it with theories that are, if not outdated, at least, like grounded in different realities.
Absolutely. The whole point of just, revisiting some of the assumptions based on which certain theories were built, and we know that those assumptions have been already disrupted by the current economic conditions, as well as social and environmental situation that we are facing in the 21st century, as Sabina says. I'm going to close it here by thanking the panelists, and again quoting Michelle Hermans, whose question we really like, but actually kind of needed to hold another hour to answer. Michelle somehow combined in his question literally designed the future research agenda, where we look at the high performance work practices, specifically finding how they can produce different types of strategic human capital individually or in combination. How would that vary, and how would that dynamically reflect the organizational environment in which we are currently operating in the different levels, be it top management teams or organization subsidiary teams and individuals. With this, I'd like to give the floor to Klaus Meyer and thank him for paying attention to such a micro level issues as international HRM, albeit the most important ones.
Thank you, Dana. Thank you, panelists. We have one informal sort of tradition here in the webinar, and that is that there has to be at least one question about COVID-19, because all of your research has been done in a past decade, pre-COVID. So I do want you to at least give me a very quick answer on the implications of COVID. Nick, are practices possibly diverging because of recent developments? Shad, is the importance of different types of human capital, according to your very interesting matrix there, going to shift as a consequence of the recent developments? And Sabina, how are the dynamic managerial capabilities that you need to operate or to lead a company successfully in a global stage going to change? Quick answers, please. Nick.
So there is some research on the impact of high-performance work systems during recessions. And what it shows is that during economic downturns, firms with high-performance work systems perform better during those downturns and they emerge stronger. So what I would put forward, my hypothesis would be that firms with really great people management systems in place, they communicate with their employees, they reward them, their employees know what they're doing. That will be quite sustainable during even a significant challenge like COVID. Those employers who manage their employees much more loosely, their employees not so clearly aligned, they will be the ones I hypothesize would have struggled during COVID.
Okay, that's a short and precise answer to my question. Shad?
Okay, so the first thing is that I believe that this typology, all these human capital aspects will still be necessary, if not more necessary. The difficulty will come in developing and hiring those different human capital capabilities. And so we're seeing this already, where organizations are struggling to train and develop people in a very online context. And so as people have fewer opportunities to travel, to get out, to work with people in different contexts, developing those capabilities will become more difficult.
Sabina?
Well, as I already mentioned, I think actually global dynamic managerial capabilities will become even more valuable in the current environment, because they will be more rare, inimitable, right? It's really harder now to acquire that human capital, international human capital and social capital, when we're constrained in our own environment. But at the same time, what I really think is that they can be utilized to manage the current situation, but really tapping into those international networks and the international knowledge that we have. As we have, more and more limited access to markets and to customers and so on, it will be even more important to actually tap into the different sources of global dynamic managerial capabilities to make decisions in this constantly changing environment that we're facing.
Okay, and final word from Dana on any of the three questions.
Thank you, Klaus. I thought you forgot about me, but I think—
How could I possibly forget about you?
What we really need to do, and that's regardless whether we do international HR, strategic human capital, international business, international management, we need to go back and revisit our taken for granted assumptions of permanent organizations with traditional employment. I can see Michael Morley is one of our participants who would definitely, back it up with more recent research. But I think what changes significantly in organizations, companies, and multinational enterprises is this combination of space, time, and task-based employment. That's not going to exist after the post-COVID, in the post-COVID time.
Okay, so we have 4 sets of hypotheses for that we can explore in future research. And I should advertise the editorial that Dana, together with Paula Caligiuri and some other friends, have written, which came out in the most recent issue of CHIPS, which actually addresses some of these questions, raises questions. With that, let me thank the participants again. I apologize to those people who asked questions who didn't get to have their question asked, because we had quite a few questions today. Thank you to the participants, Dana Minbaeva, Nick Bacon, Shad Morris, and Sabina Tasheva. And you can find their papers on GIPS, which I'm sure most of the people in the audience know. We will meet again next time, same time slot, and we will talk about how do MNEs manage social and environmental responsibilities when they face divergent pressures from different countries, like what the home country society wants might be different than the host country societies. We will have 3 papers representing our 2 journals. And with that, I thank everybody for their contributions today, and I hope to see you again next week.